Today we are going to read an excerpt from the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. And before we start, there's some background information on him. You just watched that video, and here's some additional info that was not included in the video. So, Frederick Douglass was born into enslavement in Maryland at a time when slavery was still legal in many states in the Union. As Douglass grew up, he tried to escape several times. Finally, in 1838, he succeeded. Douglass went on to become a famous speaker and writer fighting to abolish or end slavery. His autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, became a bestseller in the United States and Europe. So we are practicing our annotations again. You should be really comfortable with this by this point. And if you aren't, then maybe that's a sign that you aren't putting in as much into your annotations in Nearpod as you should be. So remember, we are looking for these things: repeated words, numbers and stats, word gaps, comparisons and contrasts, quotes, and extreme language. So we are going to read the first 2 pages together in this video, and then you are going to annotate the last 2 pages by yourself. So remember, we've talked about that setting a purpose before you read a text is super important. So if you know why you're reading it, then you should keep that in mind as we're reading it. And oftentimes we have to come up with that purpose or kind of figure out what that purpose is in school, but this text is giving it to us right away. So setting a purpose. As you read, consider why Frederick Douglass chose these particular events to write about. Think about what his focus on these events reveals about his character and his struggle for freedom. All right, let's begin. I lived in Master Hugh's family about 7 years. During this time, I succeeded in learning to read and write. In accomplishing this, I was compelled to resort to various stratagems. All right, so stratagems, this may be a word that we don't know, but we can say that it looks a lot like a word that we do know of strategies. So he's learning to read and write in many different ways. So he's probably going to tell us about those different ways. I had no regular teacher. My mistress, who had kindly commenced to instruct me, had, in compliance with the advice and direction of her husband, not only ceased to instruct, but had set her face against my being instructed by anyone else. All right, so this section, this is a long sentence, but it gives us a contrast. So we can write contrast next to it, because it says that she began, when he first came to live with them, to teach him how to read and write. But then her husband got involved, and she stopped instructing him on how to read and write and was super opposed to him learning in general. It is due, however, to my mistress to say of her that she did not adopt this course of treatment immediately. She at first lacked the depravity indispensable to shutting me up in mental darkness. All right, we may not know the word depravity, but we see it here in the footnotes, which means moral corruption. So at first, she lacked the moral corruption indispensable to shutting me up in the mental darkness, so she refused to do it at first. It was at least necessary for her to have some training in the exercise of irresponsible power to make her equal to the task of treating me as though I were a brute. Let's continue. My mistress was, as I have said, a kind and tender-hearted woman, and in the simplicity of her soul she commenced, when I first went to live with her, to treat me as she supposed one human being ought to treat another. So, though we don't know this for sure yet, but when it says, when I went to live with her, it kind of seems like he's setting us up for a compare and contrast, especially since we know that, on the first page, he said that she eventually became super mean about it. So I'm going to write contrast here, even though we haven't gotten to that yet. So at first, she treated me as like a human being. In entering upon the duties of a slaveholder, she did not seem to perceive that I sustained her to the relation of a mere chattel. So that may be a word gap. But if we scroll down here, we have a footnote that says a property or slave. So she did not seem to understand that I was her slave, and that for her to treat me as a human being was not only wrong, but dangerously so. Slavery proved as injurious to her as it did to me. So injury, maybe a word gap, but it reminds us of the word injury. So it hurt her as much as it did Fredrick Douglass. When I went there, she was a pious, warm, and tender-hearted woman. There was no sorrow or suffering for which she had not a tear or a tear. She had bread for the hungry, clothes for the naked, and comfort for every mourner that came within her reach. Slavery soon proved its ability to divest her of these heavenly qualities. So here we have a transition. We learned all about the wonderful things about her at the beginning, and now we are going to transition into how slavery has impacted her. Under its influence, the tender heart, and we're seeing the word tender a lot, so here's a repeated word, became stone, and the lamb-like disposition gave way to one of tiger-like fierceness. The first step in her downward course was in her ceasing to instruct me. She now commenced to practice her husband's precepts. She finally became even more violent in her opposition than her husband himself. She was not satisfied with simply doing as well as he commanded. She seemed anxious to do better. Nothing seemed to make her more angry than to see me with a newspaper. She seemed to think that here lay the danger. I have had her rush at me with a face made all up of fury, and snatch from me a newspaper in a manner that fully revealed her apprehension. We have it defined here for us. Her fear that he was reading. She was an apt woman, and a little experience soon demonstrated to her satisfaction that education and slavery were incompatible with each other. From this time, I was most narrowly watched. If I was in a separate room any considerable length of time, I was sure to be suspected of having a book, and was at once called to give an account of myself. All this, however, was too late. The first step had been taken. Mistress, in teaching me the alphabet, had given me the inch, and no precaution could prevent me from taking the L. The plan which I adopted, and the one by which I was most successful, was that of making friends of all the little white boys whom I met in the street. As many of these as I could, I converted into teachers. With their kindly aid, obtained at different times and in different places, I finally succeeded in learning to read. When I was sent of errands, I always took my book with me, and by going one part of my errand quickly, I found time to get a lesson before my return. I used also to carry bread with me, enough of which was always in the house, and to which I was always welcome, for I was much better off in this regard than many of the poor white children in our neighborhood. This bread I used to bestow upon the hungry little urchins, who in return would give me that more valuable bread of knowledge. All right, so we have a comparison here. He's using the word bread. So bread of knowledge is like a common phrase, when we talk about like the meat of something, the content of something. That's just another way to say that. And then he compares it to physical bread that you can eat. And he would exchange that bread with the little white boys in the street, and they would give him lessons on how to read, because they didn't realize that at that time that was not acceptable to teach a slave how to read. So now I'm going to put screenshots of the rest of the article in the Nearpod, and you're going to go through and annotate these just like before. Have a great day.